For centuries, we've been told a single story, a carefully woven timeline of progress, power, and civilization. But what if that story isn't complete? What if entire centuries were fabricated, knowledge erased, and civilizations buried not by nature, but by design? In this cinematic journey, we uncover the invisible architects of history, from lost inventors and ancient engineers to empires that vanished without a trace. We'll explore temples older than time, maps that shouldn't exist, and AI uncovering secrets the world was never meant to remember. This is the story of how history was written and rewritten. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Mysteries of Earth, where every question leads us closer to the truth humanity forgot. Every civilization tells a story about where it came from. But what if that story, like a grand monument, was built not upon truth, but upon silence? History, as we know it, is not what happened, it's what survived. The fragments that slipped through centuries of fire, war, censorship, and convenience, stitched together into a version of the past that flatters the present. We often imagine knowledge as something solid, something cumulative, each generation building on the stones laid by the last. Yet, beneath that confident structure lies an unsettling question. What if the foundations were built on erasure? Across the ancient world, memory was not simply preserved, it was curated. In Mesopotamia, the first chroniclers recorded the deeds of kings, but left the voices of farmers, builders, and scholars in dust. In Egypt, the names of pharaohs who fell from favor were chiseled out, their images hammered from temple walls as if they had never existed. Even in Greece and Rome, knowledge was political, a tool of order, not freedom. To remember selectively was to rule efficiently. And so the story of humanity began to form, not as a mirror of the past, but as a monument to power. When the Library of Alexandria burned, we mourned the books. But the greater loss was what those books represented, a worldview where every culture had a voice. Thousands of scrolls held the shared legacy of India, Africa, Babylon, and Greece. Their destruction did not just erase knowledge, it reshaped the identity of civilization itself. What remained was the illusion of a linear story, that progress belonged to a few and that all roads led to the West. But history has never been linear. It has always been a mosaic, fragments of brilliance scattered across continents, centuries, and forgotten languages. When empires rose, they built new walls atop the ruins of older worlds. When religions spread, they redefined truth. When nations formed, they drew borders not just on land, but in time, dividing what was remembered from what was allowed to fade. Even the way we measure time, our calendars, our before and after, comes from decisions made by rulers who sought to align history with authority. Entire centuries may have been compressed or expanded to fit theological and political needs. Our timeline may not be a straight road, but a map redrawn again and again to serve the powerful. And yet, through cracks in this foundation, light still seeps in. Archaeologists unearth temples older than civilization itself. Linguists find connections between ancient scripts once thought unrelated. Artificial intelligence decodes texts that human eyes could never see, revealing whispers of forgotten worlds. Bit by bit, the old architecture of history trembles. Perhaps that's the true story of humanity, not one of linear progress, but of rediscovery. A cycle of remembering, forgetting, and remembering again. The foundation beneath our feet may be cracked, but through those cracks, we glimpse something greater, a world where knowledge belonged to all, not to a chosen few. Because in the end, history is not a house, it is a living landscape. And every time we question it, every time we search beneath its floorboards, we uncover the echoes of those who were never meant to be remembered. yet refused to be erased. Before the age of empire and the roar of cannons, there were explorers who travelled not to claim, but to connect. They crossed deserts, sailed into uncharted seas, and walked through forests no map had ever named, not in the name of kings or conquest, but in the pursuit of understanding. Yet history rarely speaks their names. Their journeys left no banners, no battles, no borders, only footprints, swallowed by time. The story of exploration, as we are told, begins with conquest. We are taught to remember the ones who discovered continents already inhabited, who planted flags where cultures had thrived for millennia. But before these men of empire, others had walked these paths. They traded knowledge, not gold. They carried seeds, not swords. They were navigators, mystics, and scholars who saw the earth as a living web, not a prize to be divided. In the distant sands of Mali, centuries before Columbus, scholars and merchants from Timbuktu set sail across the Atlantic in fleets of reed boats. Their journey was one of curiosity, of learning what lay beyond the horizon, not conquering what they found. In the Himalayas, Buddhist monks followed the Silk Roads not for riches, but to share teachings of peace and observation. In the Polynesian world, voyagers navigated by stars and currents so precisely they reached every corner of the Pacific, guided only by memory, wind, and rhythm. None of these explorers wrote their victories in stone. They built no empires. They enslaved no people. Their power was in connection, not domination. And so, when history was rewritten by those who measured greatness by the number of lands conquered, these bridge builders vanished from its pages. But their legacy still breathes beneath the surface of our world. Ancient maps from Africa depict the outlines of South America long before European ships ever crossed the Atlantic. Linguistic traces line Polynesian words to South American tongues. Artifacts found in Japan mirror those of ancient Peru. Threads of culture scattered across oceans whisper the same truth. Humanity has always been connected. We were never as divided as the story of empire suggests. The tragedy is not that these explorers were forgotten. It's that the idea of exploration itself was redefined. Curiosity became conquest. Discovery became domination. The unknown was no longer a mystery to approach with wonder, but a void to be claimed and controlled. In this transformation, the soul of exploration was lost. And yet, even in silence, the echoes of the forgotten remain. The ancient navigators of the Indian Ocean, who mapped currents through the migration of birds, the desert travelers of the Tuareg, who read the stars like sacred text, the scholars of Baghdad's House of Wisdom, who translated the world's knowledge into a single language of reason. Each one a reminder that exploration was once an act of unity, a celebration of what connects us, not what divides us. Perhaps the greatest explorers were not those who found new worlds, but those who reminded us that the world was already one. Because in the end, the true measure of exploration is not in the distance we travel, but in the bridges we build between minds, cultures, and hearts. Bridges strong enough to outlast the empires that once buried their names. History is often described as a story written by the victors. But the truth runs deeper. The victors did not simply write history. They rewrote time itself. When empires expanded across continents, they did more than claim territory. They conquered memory. They entered ancient worlds not just with swords and ships, but with ink and parchment, rewriting the stories of those who had lived, thrived, and dreamed long before their arrival. In the quiet aftermath of conquest, when the smoke cleared and cities lay in ruins, came the final act of domination, the rewriting of the past. The colonial powers of Europe were masters of this craft. In Africa, they redrew maps as if civilizations had never existed before their arrival, as though the pyramids, manuscripts, and universities of Timbuktu were spontaneous miracles birthed by discovery. In the Americas, they erased thousands of years of indigenous science, astronomy, and architecture, replacing them with tales of savages awaiting salvation. And across Asia, the empires of trade became empires of narrative, reducing vast dynasties into fragments of exotic history. By reshaping time, they reshaped identity. Entire cultures were rewritten as primitive prefaces to European progress. Their art became folk, their science mysticism, their faith superstition. This wasn't mere propaganda. It was a reprogramming of humanity's collective memory. The conquerors didn't only seize gold and land, they seized the right to define civilization itself. They understood that power is not sustained by armies alone. It is sustained by stories. If you can control how people see their past, you can control how they imagine their future. And so began the great editing of time, a selective preservation of what served empire and the quiet burial of what did not. The chronicles of entire civilizations were lost in translation. Sometimes literally. European scholars translated texts from Sanskrit, Arabic, and Chinese, carefully omitting anything that contradicted their worldview. Indigenous oral histories were dismissed as myth. Ancient inventions, from African metallurgy to Indian surgery, were attributed to European rediscovery. Even the timeline of human evolution was adjusted to place the West at the center of progress. And yet, for all their efforts, the truth endures. Buried beneath cathedrals and colonial archives, fragments of the real story survive. The manuscripts of Baghdad's scientists, the navigational maps of the Pacific Islanders, the astronomical alignments of temples older than history itself. Each discovery cracks open the illusion that empire built, that the modern world was born from a single source. In truth, humanity has always been a chorus, a collaboration of countless voices echoing through time. But empire taught us to hear only one. As we begin to re-examine history, we find that the past was not stolen entirely, only rearranged, labeled, and locked away. The question is not whether empires rewrote time. They did. The question is whether we can remember what was written before. Because history is not a single book written by one hand. It is a vast library. Some shelves burned, some hidden, and some waiting to be rediscovered. And perhaps the greatest act of rebellion today is not to rewrite history again, but to restore the voices that were silenced when empires learned to tell the story of time itself. There was a time when the earth was a mosaic of genius, where civilizations rose from the sands, the jungles, and the mountains with knowledge that defied imagination. From the Indus Valley to Nubia, from the high Andes to the banks of the Niger, humanity thrived in brilliant isolation, not as rivals, but as reflections of the same boundless curiosity. Yet centuries later, these worlds would be described not as civilizations, but as curiosities. The conquerors would call them primitive, backward, even non-existent. And so began one of history's most deliberate acts of erasure. When European explorers first set foot on the banks of the Indus, they found cities older than Rome, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, with precise urban grids, advanced drainage systems, and a written script still undeciphered. But because they could not understand it, they diminished it. Colonial historians labeled it prehistory, as if complexity could not exist before conquest. In Africa, the same pattern unfolded. The pyramids of Sudan, taller and more numerous than those of Egypt, were called imitations. The stone walls of Great Zimbabwe, a fortress city of precision-cut granite built without mortar, were so advanced that early European archaeologists refused to believe Africans could have built them. They invented phantom builders, lost white tribes, and biblical wanderers, anything to deny the genius of the people who lived there. And in the heart of Mali stood Timbuktu, once home to thousands of manuscripts on astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. a city where scholars debated science, while much of Europe still struggled to light its streets. Yet textbooks reduced it to a word for remoteness, from here to Timbuktu, as if it were a place lost to time, not a beacon of knowledge. Across the ocean, in the Andes and the rainforests of Central America, the story was the same. The Incas' road network stretched over 25,000 miles through mountains and deserts, built with such precision that they still stand today. The Maya charted the movements of stars with mathematics so advanced it would not be matched for centuries. The Aztecs engineered floating cities on lakes, sustaining millions in a self-sufficient ecosystem. But when the conquerors came, they saw only temples and sacrifices, because to acknowledge the brilliance of these civilizations would mean admitting the falsehood of their own superiority. And so the narrative was rewritten. The colonizers declared themselves the torchbearers of progress, arriving to bring light to a dark world. The irony, of course, was that the light had been burning long before they ever arrived. Archaeology, too, became a weapon. Discoveries that contradicted Western timelines were buried or dismissed. Artifacts that proved trade between distant continents were hidden in museum vaults, labeled anomalies. And the myth of linear progress, from primitive to modern, from dark to enlightened, was solidified into education systems around the world. But the earth remembers. Beneath the sands of Nubia, the jungles of the Yucatan, and the stones of Mohenjo-Daro, the truth waits patiently. The lost scripts, the star maps, the cities aligned with celestial precision. They are whispers of a world that was once whole, before it was divided by conquest and arrogance. The erasure of the ancient world wasn't just about stealing the past. It was about controlling the future, ensuring that generations would grow up believing greatness had a single origin, that genius belonged to one hemisphere, one color, one creed. Yet every discovery, every unearthed city, every decoded symbol pulls another thread from that illusion. The truth doesn't vanish. It waits. And now, as we rediscover what was lost, we're forced to confront. Now to a question far greater than any empire dared to ask. What if the story of civilization was never about who came first, but about who was allowed to be remembered? Empires are not destroyed by rebellion. They are undone by remembrance. Because rebellion ends when the soldiers fall. But memory outlives them all. For every empire that rose to power, there came a moment of realization that to rule forever, force was never enough. Armies could crush resistance, but they could not kill what people remembered. The stories whispered in secret, the songs of ancestors, the names carved into temple walls, these were more dangerous than any weapon. They carried truth, identity, and defiance. And so, the great project of control began, not of land, but of time. Throughout history, rulers have feared not what people do, but what they recall. To govern the future, they first had to conquer the past. From Rome to the British Empire, from ancient dynasties to modern superpowers, the same formula repeated: erase, rewrite, replace. When the conquerors marched into foreign lands, they didn't just burn cities, they burned libraries. They didn't just take gold, they took chronicles. The great library of Alexandria, the scrolls of Nalanda, the codices of the Maya. Each destruction was not an accident of war, but a deliberate cleansing of inconvenient memory. Because history, when told truthfully, exposes the illusion of authority. It reminds people that before the empire came, they had their own systems, their own knowledge, their own gods, that they were never helpless, never unworthy. And that simple realization, that one's ancestors once stood tall, is the seed of every revolution. So, the powerful learned to bury memory under layers of narrative. They painted the past as chaos, and themselves as salvation. They replaced philosophers with prophets, inventors with conquerors, and erased the names of women, scientists, and thinkers who once defined their worlds. In colonial classrooms, children learned to memorize dates of empire, not the epics of their own civilizations. They learned who discovered their land, not who had built it. In time, generations would grow up believing that their ancestors contributed little, that progress arrived from elsewhere, and that gratitude, not curiosity, was the proper response to history. It was the perfect system. No censorship could be more complete than one carried willingly in the mind. When you no longer remember who you were, you stop questioning who rules you. But the cracks are forming. Because buried memory never dies. It waits. Across the world, people are uncovering fragments of what was erased. Digitized manuscripts, lost languages, forgotten maps. Ancient temples once dismissed as primitive are now recognized as marvels of science and astronomy. Oral traditions once ignored are revealing precise knowledge of stars, migrations and events thousands of years old. And as these memories resurface, the old order begins to tremble. Because the greatest fear of every empire, ancient or modern, is that people will remember they never needed saving. The fear of remembering is the fear of losing control. That's why history was rewritten, why timelines were adjusted, why knowledge was hidden behind institutions and credentials. The rulers of time understood. Once people remember where they come from, they will no longer accept the world as it is. So perhaps the true revolution is not in arms or ideology, but in recollection, in daring to remember what we were told to forget. Because when memory returns, power shifts. And when the world begins to remember itself, no empire, no institution, no rewritten history can withstand it. The conquest of the world did not end with the fall of kingdoms or the signing of treaties. It continued, quietly, methodically, in the classroom. Empires learned long ago that the most efficient way to control a people was not through chains or armies, but through education. The sword conquers the body. The textbook conquers the mind. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as colonial powers stretched across continents, they built schools wherever they ruled, but these were not temples of enlightenment. They were laboratories of obedience, designed not to awaken minds, but to align them, not to teach people who they were, but who they were supposed to be. Children in India learned the glories of the British Empire, but not of Harappa, Nalanda, or the astronomers of Ujjain. African students memorized European explorers, but never the names of their own kings, engineers, or builders of empires that predated Greece. In the Americas, native children were forced into missionary schools, their languages forbidden, their songs silenced, told their ancestors were primitive and their gods were wrong. This was not ignorance. It was strategy. Every empire understood that if you could rewrite a child's understanding of history, you could rewrite their understanding of themselves. And when that happens, rebellion becomes unthinkable, not because the people are weak, but because they no longer remember the strength they once had. Education became the soft power of colonization, elegant, efficient, invisible. It taught people to measure their worth by foreign standards, to speak in borrowed tongues, to look at their own culture through the lens of shame. It replaced wisdom with curriculum, heritage with hierarchy, and curiosity with conformity. And the irony? The colonized began to compete for excellence within the very system designed to erase them. Degrees, exams, credentials. I became symbols of advancement, even as they reinforced the belief that progress came only through imitation. The textbook became the sacred script of a new global religion, the worship of the approved narrative. But buried within this quiet obedience lies a haunting truth. Every empire that rewrote history also rewrote education. Ancient schools of philosophy and science once thrived across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. They taught astronomy, medicine, and mathematics centuries before Europe's so-called Enlightenment. Yet their legacies were dismantled, their libraries burned, their methods replaced with imported systems that prized memorization over understanding. Even today, modern education still carries the DNA of empire. We study history as a linear ladder, always climbing toward modernity, always beginning in the West. We learn of wars and kings, but not of healers, inventors, or poets who changed the world in quieter, deeper ways. We celebrate discovery, but rarely ask, discovered by whom? It's no coincidence that in every colonized nation, the same structure remains. The exam, the uniform, the national anthem, the pledge. These rituals of belonging are not accidental. They were built to ensure that the empire's story outlived the empire itself. But something is shifting. Around the world, new generations are unlearning the lessons of forgetfulness. They are rediscovering indigenous knowledge systems, reprinting old manuscripts, teaching languages once banned, and recentering the story of civilization. Slowly, the classroom is becoming a place of remembrance again. Because the most radical act in a world built on curated knowledge is not rebellion, it is remembering. To teach the forbidden names, to read the erased texts, to question the questions themselves. And when that happens, the classroom ceases to be a weapon. It becomes what it was always meant to be, a place where truth is not taught but rediscovered. There was a time when the sands of Egypt whispered the truth, before the chisel and brush of empire reshaped its memory. Beneath the golden light of the Nile Valley, the world's first architects, astronomers, and mathematicians laid the foundations of civilization. But when their story reached the halls of Europe, it arrived altered, retold through the gaze of those who needed history to begin with them. For centuries, Egypt was seen as the mother of science and art, a civilization of dark-skinned Africans who mapped the stars, embalmed the dead with surgical precision, and carved knowledge into stone. The Greeks called Egypt their teacher. The Romans bowed to its mystery. Even early scholars of Europe studied its philosophy to understand their own origins. But somewhere between discovery and domination, the story began to change. As colonialism expanded, so did the need to justify it. Empires could not rule if they believed those they conquered had once ruled the world. And so, history was remodeled, painted lighter, rewritten smoother, polished until uncomfortable truths disappeared beneath layers of illusion. In the 19th century, when European explorers began excavating Egyptian tombs, they were not merely uncovering artifacts. They were reconstructing identity. Statues with African features were described as idealized or symbolic. Mummies with dark skin tones were ignored or mislabeled. Artists redrew ancient faces to resemble the Europe they admired, not the Africa they found. Museums displayed Egypt not as a part of Africa, but as a distant cousin to Greece, a stepping stone toward Western civilization. It was more than misinterpretation. It was deliberate design. The whitening of Egypt was not only a question of race, it was a question of ownership. If Egypt could be made European, then Europe could claim the birthright of civilization itself. Every pyramid, every hieroglyph, every temple would become evidence of Western genius, not African brilliance. The continent that once taught the world astronomy and medicine was reduced to the background of its own story. Even in modern textbooks, the illusion lingers. The maps separate Egypt from Africa. The language of archaeology still echoes colonial thought, discovered, civilized, advanced. But the people who built the Sphinx and aligned monuments with the stars did not need discovery. They were the discoverers. And yet, beneath the layers of myth, the truth still breathes. DNA studies, ancient art, and linguistic traces confirm what the ancients themselves proclaimed, that Egypt was an African civilization, born from the heart of the Nile, nourished by the cultures of Nubia, Kush, and the greater continent. The pharaohs were not white demigods from Europe's imagination, but African rulers whose legacy transcended borders and skin. Still, the whitening did not stop at Egypt. The same pattern unfolded across the ancient world, from the Olmecs of Mesoamerica to the Dravidians of the Indus Valley. Their achievements were too vast to deny, yet too threatening to acknowledge. And so, they were borrowed, rebranded, absorbed into a single narrative where all greatness flowed one way, toward the West. But history has a strange way of resurfacing. Each generation rediscovers what the last tried to bury. Digital archives restore erased faces. African scholars reclaim the lineage of the Nile. Artists and scientists alike are rebuilding the bridge between past and truth. Slowly, the color returns to history's faded canvas. Because in the end, civilization was never the property of one race or one continent. It was, and always will be, a collective memory of humanity, written in countless shades of brilliance. And when the pharaohs are finally seen in their true light, we don't just rewrite Egypt's story, but we rewrite our own. In the quiet flicker of flame, humanity's greatest memories were erased. Scroll by scroll, page by page, the light of knowledge dimmed, not by accident, but by intention. For every empire that rose upon the ashes of another, the first target was never the army. It was the library. From Alexandria to Timbuktu, knowledge was power, and power had to be controlled. The Library of Alexandria, that mythical beacon of learning, stood as the brain of the ancient world. Within its walls were the writings of scholars from Greece, Egypt, Persia, India, and beyond. Astronomers charted the stars, physicians documented cures, and philosophers debated the nature of the soul. It was a temple to human curiosity itself. But curiosity can be dangerous to those who rule by ignorance. The story of Alexandria's fall is told as tragedy. A fire, an accident of war, the misfortune of history. Yet behind every spark lies intent. Successive empires, from the Romans to the early Christians to the conquerors who came after, each had their part in its erasure. The destruction was not a single moment, but a long campaign against memory. When a civilization wants to dominate, it doesn't just conquer land. It conquers what people believe about their past. By erasing what came before, every ruler could claim to be the beginning of the world's story. And so, the flames spread. Across the sands of Africa, another beacon of wisdom thrived. The city of Timbuktu. In the 14th and 15th centuries, its libraries held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, treatises on medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and law. Scholars gathered from across the Sahara, debating ideas long before Europe's Renaissance began. But as colonial expansion reached Africa, the old centers of knowledge became targets once again. Libraries were looted, manuscripts scattered or sold to collectors, entire histories dismissed as myth. Yabulvi had survived now lies hidden in private homes, fragile and fading, the last remnants of a forgotten intellectual empire. The same story echoes across the world. In China, the Qin dynasty burned ancient texts to erase philosophies that challenged imperial control. In the Americas, Spanish priests set fire to Mayan codices, declaring them works of the devil. In Baghdad, the Mongol invasion turned the libraries of the Abbasid Caliphate, the heart of the Islamic Golden Age, into rivers of ink that ran black through the Tigris. Everywhere knowledge was abundant, power responded with fire. Because the true purpose of burning books was never destruction, it was replacement. When one story is erased, another can be written in its place. A simpler story, a cleaner one, a version of the past that justifies the present. And yet, not all was lost. Like embers under ash, fragments survived, hidden by scholars who risked their lives to preserve them. In Timbuktu, Families wrapped manuscripts in cloth and buried them in desert sands. In Alexandria, some scrolls were copied by travelers who carried them to distant lands. In the Andes and the Indus, wisdom lived on through oral traditions, encoded in symbols, songs, and stone. The libraries may have burned, but the human instinct to remember never did. Today, digital archives and archaeologists attempt to rebuild what centuries of empire tried to erase. Fragments of papyrus, half-burned manuscripts, and rediscovered codices are revealing what the flames couldn't consume. A vision of history far more connected, diverse, and advanced than we were taught to believe. Perhaps that is the final truth of the vanished libraries. Knowledge cannot truly be destroyed. It only hides, waiting for those who dare to seek it again. And as we uncover these ashes of wisdom, we realize the greatest fire was never in the libraries. It was in the fear of those who wanted them gone. History remembers the conquerors, not the questioners. Yet it was the questioners, the thinkers who dared to see beyond borders, dogma, and empire, who truly shaped our understanding of the universe. Their ideas built the foundation of modern science, yet their names were scattered, erased, or confined to footnotes in textbooks that praise others for their discoveries. Centuries before Newton bent light through a prism, a man in the heart of the Islamic world was already unraveling its mysteries. His name was Ibn al-Haytham, known in the West as Al-Hazan. Living in 10th century Basra and Cairo, he transformed the way we perceive vision itself. While Europe slept through what it called the Dark Ages, Ibn al-Haytham experimented with lenses, reflection and refraction, discovering that sight was not emitted from the eyes, but received by them, a revelation that would one day give birth to modern optics, photography, and telescopes. Yet, in the retelling of science, his name was nearly extinguished. His works translated into Latin lost their origin. His theories appeared centuries later under new authorship in languages that erased his Arabic script. The story of light was rewritten to fit the European dawn of enlightenment. Long before him, another light had been extinguished, that of Hypatia of Alexandria, a woman who taught philosophy, astronomy, and mathematics at a time when the world of ideas was dominated by men. In the 4th century, she stood as a bridge between the wisdom of Greece and the emerging knowledge of a changing empire. Her lectures on celestial mechanics and geometry drew students from across the Mediterranean. But her brilliance made her a threat. In an age when belief and power sought simplicity, Hypatia represented complexity, a mind unbound by doctrine. She was accused of heresy, dragged from her chariot, and murdered by a mob. With her D.A. Zeth, not only a life, but an entire lineage of female scholarship was extinguished. Libraries fell silent. The idea that a woman could be the keeper of cosmic knowledge was buried for 1,000 years. And then, far to the east, in 18th century China, a young woman named Wang Zhenyi dared to defy her world's constraints. Born into a time when women were denied formal education, she taught herself astronomy and mathematics by candlelight. She built her own instruments, modeled lunar eclipses with mirrors and lamps, and wrote treatises explaining that these celestial events were not divine omens, but the predictable dance of shadow and light. Wang Zhenyi's clarity of mind rivaled the best astronomers of her time. Yet her works, too, faded into obscurity, overshadowed by men celebrated as the voices of reason. The silence surrounding her name was not an accident. It was a reflection of a world that measured genius not by discovery, but by who was allowed to be seen discovering. Across continents and centuries, the pattern repeats. Brilliant minds outside Europe, from India's Aryabhata to Mali's Ahmad Baba, from the Persian polymath Al-Khwarizmi to the Mayan astronomer priests, contributed to the very mathematics, medicine, and cosmology that shaped modern science. But when colonial narratives were written, progress was redrawn as a single line pointing toward the West. The result was not just the loss of credit, but the loss of connection, a broken chain of human curiosity that once stretched across the earth. Yet today, the forgotten scientists are returning. Their manuscripts, rediscovered in archives, are being translated anew. Their names are whispered again in classrooms and documentaries, their experiments reconstructed by those determined to restore truth. Slowly, the erased constellations of history are lighting up once more. Because progress was never born in one place, one race, or one age, it was a mosaic, crafted by countless minds who looked at the same sky and asked the same question, why? And the greatest act of remembrance we can perform is to say their names again, clearly, proudly, and without apology.
Every great invention tells two stories, the one the world remembers and the one it forgets. Behind every celebrated genius stands a shadowed figure. The one who built the prototype, who drew the first design, who spoke the idea before it was safe to write it down. History does not erase inventions, it erases ownership. Across centuries, the flow of genius was redirected, renamed, repackaged, and given to those whose faces fit the acceptable narrative of progress. In the American South, where cotton was wealth and bondage was law, enslaved black inventors reshaped the machinery that drove an empire. They built engines, tools, and devices that changed industry, yet the patents could never bear their names. Their brilliance was absorbed into the legacy of their enslavers, their ideas recorded as property rather than creation. The world celebrated innovation, but not the innovators. In 1845, a man named Benjamin Montgomery, an enslaved mechanic, designed a revolutionary steamboat propeller, more efficient, faster, safer. His invention was denied a patent because by law he was not considered a citizen. His design was later adopted under another name, credited to men who never touched the blueprint. Montgomery's genius lived on in silence. The invention remembered, the inventor erased. The pattern transcends borders and centuries. In ancient China, the art of printing emerged long before Gutenberg pressed ink into history. Woodblock printing and movable type, developed by Bi Sheng in the 11th century, changed the world's relationship with knowledge. But when Europe industrialized it centuries later, the invention was rebranded as a European miracle. The same pattern appeared in mathematics, navigation, even medicine, where discoveries from the Arab, Indian, and African worlds were rewritten under Latinized names. The erasures were not always distant or ancient. In 1951, a woman named Rosalind Franklin captured the first clear image of DNA's double helix, the structure of life itself. Her photograph, Photo 51, became the cornerstone of the discovery that would win the Nobel Prize. Yet when the award was announced, her name was absent. The credit went to Watson, Crick, and Wilkins, the faces the world was ready to celebrate. And so, the story repeated. Brilliance reframed, ownership reassigned. Even the word invention became a tool of hierarchy, a way to define who creates and who merely contributes. When European colonizers encountered indigenous technologies, from the agricultural terraces of the Andes to the water management systems of the Indus, they called them mysteries, not innovations. The genius of other cultures had to remain invisible for the myth of Western exceptionalism to survive. But history's thefts were not flawless. The traces remain, in forgotten journals, in oral histories, in languages that carried the truth when paper could not. Scholars now uncover patents once denied, manuscripts attributed to anonymous minds, and blueprints hidden behind empires' signatures. And in that rediscovery lies a deeper question. What would our understanding of human progress look like if every stolen name were restored? If every erased inventor stood beside their creation once more? Perhaps then we would see that genius was never the privilege of one civilization, one race, or one gender. It was a universal inheritance, scattered, suppressed,
yet never destroyed. The act of reclaiming these names is not merely historical correction. It is moral restoration, a return of light to those corners where innovation once bloomed in silence. Because invention is not just the creation of a thing, it is the courage to imagine what does not yet exist. And for every name that was taken, that courage endures. The future may still be written by new hands, but the truth of invention belongs to all of them.
Every monument has a shadow. Every empire, a silent foundation. Behind the marble statues and golden thrones, history hides the true architects of civilization, the nameless engineers, builders, and thinkers, whose genius built the world, yet whose names never reached its books. We celebrate the kings who commissioned, but not the hands that constructed. We remember the philosophers who theorized, but not the minds who materialized those theories into stone, steel, and soul. Civilization, it seems, was always written by those who owned it, not those who made it. Take the Great Pyramids of Giza. We're taught to imagine whips, slaves, and royal decrees, yet modern archaeology reveals something far more human, a society of skilled laborers, architects, and artisans who worked not in chains, but in pride. Their fingerprints remain pressed into ancient clay, their graffiti still etched on hidden walls. They had names that never entered the record, the invisible workforce whose mathematics and engineering outlasted kingdoms. Across the ocean, in the heart of the Andes, the Inca Empire built cities that defy time. Machu Picchu stands upon terraces that drink the rain and feed the mountain, a living machine of stone. No blueprints, no iron tools, no written manuals, only geometry born of intuition and generations of indigenous genius. Yet when Spanish chroniclers arrived, they dismissed these wonders as primitive miracles, unable to believe that a so-called savage people had mastered the mathematics of mountains. The story repeats across continents. In West Africa, the Mali Empire thrived under minds like those who designed Timbuktu's libraries, whose architects aligned mud brick structures with cosmic precision. Their work was not preserved in marble but in memory, a memory later buried under colonial maps that declared Africa a land of darkness. In reality, it was the birthplace of light, intellectual light, mathematical light, extinguished only by the rewriting of history. Even the canals of Mesopotamia, the aqueducts of Persia, the wind towers of Yazd, each required invisible architects, mathematicians, masons, craftsmen, enslaved workers, and indigenous inventors who turned the chaos of nature into systems of survival. Their reward? Silence. Their recognition? Erasure. Because to acknowledge them would have meant acknowledging a truth the empires could not bear, that civilization is not the gift of the few, but the labor of the many. And so their legacy was rewritten as myth. Their names dissolved, their achievements reassigned to emperors, priests, and conquerors. But even silence leaves a pattern. It lives in the perfect alignment of ancient temples with solstices, in the durability of forgotten roads that outlast the modern highways built upon them. Today, when archaeologists uncover an artifact with unknown authorship, it's labeled anonymous. But anonymous is not a name. It is a wound. A reminder that for every Da Vinci, there were dozens whose genius was unrecorded. For every Newton, hundreds who observed the same stars but spoke in tongues never translated. And yet, the invisible architects are not truly gone. Their work endures, in the symmetry of every city, in the mathematics of every structure, in the systems that still sustain us. They remind us that civilization was never a pyramid built from the top down, but a network, millions of invisible hands weaving the fabric of progress from the ground up. To remember them is to restore balance. To speak their names, even if lost, is to honor a truth greater than empire, that humanity's greatest works were never born in palaces,
but in the quiet brilliance of those who built them. Because history remembers the rulers who ordered civilization into being, but the earth remembers the ones who actually built it. What if time itself had been edited? What if 300 years of human history, entire dynasties, battles, inventions, even people, never existed at all? It sounds impossible, absurd. Yet beneath the surface of our recorded timeline, there lies a theory that dares to question the very foundation of how we measure history itself. It's called the phantom time hypothesis. And if it were true, it would mean that we are living not in the year 2025, but perhaps closer to 1725. The story begins in the 1990s, when a German historian named Heribert Illig noticed something strange. He found that the records of early medieval Europe, from 614 to 911 AD, were alarmingly thin. Buildings that should exist didn't. Documents were missing, or strangely repetitive. Technological and artistic progress seemed to freeze for centuries, as if time itself had stopped moving. Illig proposed a daring idea, that these 3 centuries never happened. That Emperor Otto III, together with Pope Sylvester II, may have conspired to insert phantom years into the calendar, placing themselves neatly at the dawn of the first millennium. In other words, the Middle Ages as we know them could be an illusion, manufactured for power, prestige, and the rewriting of time itself. To most historians, it sounded like madness. But then came the anomalies, fragments of evidence that refused to fit the official timeline. Buildings dated to the 10th century that used construction styles centuries ahead of their time. Coin inscriptions and royal decrees repeating dates that shouldn't overlap. A calendar reform under Pope Gregory XIII that curiously corrected for extra days that shouldn't have existed, unless phantom centuries had been added. Even outside Europe, mysteries appeared. Chinese, Islamic, and Byzantine records from that same period also showed strange discontinuities, missing decades, overlapping, rulers, and inexplicable gaps in correspondence. And in the heart of Europe, between the fall of Rome and the rise of the Renaissance, there existed a historical silence so vast that even mainstream historians once called it the Dark Ages. Could it be that this darkness wasn't just cultural, but chronological? If true, the implications would be staggering. It would mean that many of the medieval figures we study, Charlemagne, early Holy Roman emperors, even entire wars, may have been literary inventions written centuries later to justify political continuity. It would mean the way we date artifacts, buildings, and events could be off by hundreds of years. And more disturbingly, it would mean history itself, the timeline we all accept, was once tampered with by human hands. Skeptics argue the theory collapses under scientific dating methods, dendrochronology, radiocarbon testing, and astronomical alignments. Yet even these methods rely on human interpretation, and interpretation, like history, can be shaped. Because when you control the calendar, you control the rhythm of civilization. You control anniversaries, jubilees, divine milestones. You can erase your enemies not by burning their names, but by removing their century. Maybe the phantom time hypothesis isn't entirely right. Maybe those centuries did happen, or maybe, as with all history, they happened differently than we were told. But Illig's question remains hauntingly relevant. Who benefits from the way we measure time? For if history can be rewritten, then why not the calendar itself? And if time has been rewritten once, how many more times has it happened? Because in the end, the phantom time hypothesis isn't just about missing years. It's about something far deeper. The terrifying possibility that the story of humanity has been bent, folded, and edited to fit someone's idea of order. And if even me can be rewritten, what else has been? Time. We think of it as constant, absolute, untouchable.
But what if it isn't? What if the timeline we live by, our years, our centuries, our very sense of when, was shaped not by nature, but by power? Throughout history, calendars have never simply measured time. They've defined it. They've set the rhythm of empires, the pulse of religion, and the order of civilizations. And in that control lies one of humanity's oldest and quietest manipulations, the rewriting of when history happened and for whom. Long before atomic clocks and digital seconds, time was political. In ancient Egypt, pharaohs reset the calendar with each reign, marking history not in universal years, but in eras of divine rule. To the people, time began and ended with the pharaoh's heartbeat. In China, dynasties renamed entire eras, the year of the dragon throne, the age of heaven's mandate, ensuring that memory itself revolved around imperial authority. And in Rome, the Julian calendar was not just an astronomical correction by Julius Caesar, it was a declaration of power. Caesar redefined the solar year, tying the flow of time to his own name, his legacy, and Rome's eternal dominion. Centuries later, a new calendar would again rewrite time, this time under the Church. When Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian reform in 1582, he was not merely fixing the drift of the equinox. He was uniting Christendom under a single divine clock, one that reset centuries of local calendars, pagan rhythms, and lunar reckonings. In the process, 10 entire days vanished. October 4th was followed not by October 5th, but by October 15th, and the world obeyed. Yet this wasn't the first time time itself had been rewritten. Medieval rulers often backdated documents to give divine legitimacy to their thrones. Popes adjusted chronologies to align prophecies with their reigns. Even entire genealogies were forged to connect kingdoms with ancient heroes or biblical patriarchs. The past became a tool, a pliable, malleable narrative that could be expanded, shortened, or rearranged to make power appear eternal. Think of Emperor Otto III, who, as some scholars suggest, may have added years to the Christian calendar to place his rule at the dawn of the first millennium, the symbolic age of Christ's return. A divine marketing campaign on a cosmic scale. Or the scribes of medieval courts quietly rewriting chronicles to place their patrons in the pages of destiny, erasing their rivals as if they had never drawn breath. Every civilization, it seems, wanted not only to exist in time, but to own it. And so, history became elastic. Entire epochs could stretch or shrink depending on who wrote them. Ancient kings became older, empires more glorious, and religions older than their rivals. In this silent war over chronology, time became the ultimate prize, because whoever shaped the timeline shaped truth itself. Even our modern reckoning, before Christ and Anno Domini, is not neutral. It encodes belief, culture, and hierarchy into every year we utter. The calendar is not just a tool. It's a mirror of our collective obedience, the invisible architecture of control that we rarely question. Today, when we say we live in the year 2025, we rarely ask, 2025 since when? Since whose beginning? Whose story are we following through time? Perhaps there was never a single timeline, only overlapping versions, edited and erased, shaped by rulers who understood that power over time is power over memory. The timeline we know may be the one that survived, the one that fit, the one that history allowed to remain. And so, as we count the seconds, minutes, and centuries, we might remember this. Time is not only what we measure, it's what we believe. Long before the pyramids pierced the Egyptian sky, before Sumer wrote its first words in clay, there was a hill in ancient Anatolia, buried beneath 12,000 years of silence. Göbekli Tepe. To the untrained eye,
It's little more than a mound of stone, but beneath that soil lies a secret that rewrote everything we thought we knew about human civilization. When archaeologists first brushed away the dust of time in the 1990s, they expected to find a simple Neolithic village, the kind of place where farmers had just begun to tame the land. What they uncovered instead was a temple complex older than any known civilization on Earth. Massive T-shaped pillars, each weighing up to 20 tons, arranged in perfect circles, carvings of lions, scorpions, vultures, an entire language of symbols etched in limestone long before the invention of writing. And at the center of it all, geometry, astronomy, and precision that seemed impossible for hunter-gatherers. Göbekli Tepe wasn't a settlement. There were no homes, no hearths, no traces of daily life. It was a monument, a place of ritual, a gathering built not by farmers, but by nomads. And that single truth shattered the story of human progress. For decades, textbooks told us civilization began with agriculture, that people settled first, then built cities, then temples. But Göbekli Tepe reversed the sequence entirely. It whispered a different origin story, one where belief came before bread, and spirituality gave rise to civilization itself. Even more astonishing was its age. Radiocarbon dating placed its construction around 9,500 BCE, nearly 7,000 years before Stonehenge, 6,000 before the pyramids, and long before the wheel, writing, or organized kingdoms. In one stroke, it forced historians to redraw the map of prehistory. Who were these builders? How did people with no metal tools, no domesticated animals, and no cities carve and lift stones that even modern cranes would struggle to move? No one knows. But the precision and symbolism suggest something far more complex, a lost understanding of architecture, mathematics, and the cosmos. And Göbekli Tepe isn't alone. Across the world, other sites echo the same silent question. Karahantepe, just miles away, reveals even older craftsmanship, buried beneath time. In Peru, the ruins of Caral rise from the desert, vast pyramids dating back nearly 5,000 years, untouched by war and older than any in Egypt. In Turkey, Nevaluchori offers similar T-shaped stones, hinting that Göbekli Tepe was not a miracle, but part of a forgotten network of sacred knowledge. It's as if these temples were built by a civilization the world has chosen to forget, one that understood the stars, the earth, and the rhythms of life in ways we still cannot explain. Even stranger, Göbekli Tepe was intentionally buried around 8,000 BCE. Its builders, whoever they were, covered it with tons of earth and stone, preserving it for millennia. Why? Was it an act of reverence, or a warning? Did they know something was coming? A flood? A cataclysm? A turning of the ages? When we look at its pillars, we are staring into the eyes of a world that refused to die, a world that left behind a message carved in stone, waiting for us to find it. And when we finally did, it asked the question our history books still cannot answer. What if civilization did not begin in Mesopotamia, but was reborn there after something older fell? Göbekli Tepe stands as a monument not just to human hands, but to human memory. The first whisper of a story we've only begun to remember. Perhaps we are not the peak of civilization. Perhaps we are its echo.
They called it the Dark Ages, 1,000 years of ignorance, superstition, and silence, or so we were told. But history, when examined closely, glows beneath the soot. And in that glow, a different truth emerges. It was never the world that went dark. It was the memory of its light. When Rome fell, the narrative claims civilization crumbled with it. Knowledge disappeared, progress halted, and humanity drifted into intellectual sleep. But across the deserts, mountains, and coastlines of the Old World,
another story was unfolding, one of invention, of preservation, of discovery. While Europe mourned its lost empire, libraries in Baghdad, Cordoba, and Samarkand blazed with brilliance. In the House of Wisdom, scholars translated the works of Greece, Persia, and India, not to preserve them, but to expand them. They calculated the curvature of the earth, mapped the stars, designed surgical instruments, and measured the speed of light centuries before Europe would rediscover the telescope. In Timbuktu, thousands of manuscripts lay hidden in clay vaults, astronomy, medicine, mathematics, proving that Africa was not a dark continent, but a continent of light, whose knowledge simply refused to fit Western timelines. And in China, during those same dark centuries, engineers were designing earthquake detectors, printing books, and charting the heavens with precision unmatched anywhere else on Earth. So how did the light become shadow? How did an era of science, poetry, and exploration become remembered as one of ignorance? The answer lies not in time, but in power. History, as written by empires, needed contrast. To glorify the Renaissance, something had to precede it, something dim, primitive, and waiting for rescue. So the centuries that thrived under different hands, different gods, and different colors were recast as a void. The Islamic Golden Age became a footnote. The scholars of Africa, India, and Asia became ghosts, and Europe, reborn from its own wars and plagues, declared itself the light that ended the dark. But when we strip away the filters of conquest, we see that light never vanished. It simply moved. From Baghdad's observatories to Mali's manuscripts, from Chinese polymaths to Mayan astronomers, the torch of knowledge passed quietly, invisibly, from one civilization to the next. Even in medieval Europe, the flame flickered in unexpected corners. In monasteries, monks preserved texts that would one day reawaken the West. In hidden workshops, alchemists, part scientist, part philosopher, experimented with matter and motion long before Newton was born. The darkness was not total, it was selective. The light never truly left humanity, only the record of it did. And so the myth of the Dark Ages was born. A convenient metaphor that erased the brilliance of others, compressing centuries of human progress into a single shadowed silence. But that silence was not ignorance, it was censorship. Today, as we uncover lost manuscripts, ancient inventions, and buried cities, we begin to see how much was deliberately hidden beneath that word, dark. Because every empire needs a dawn to define itself, and every dawn demands a night before it. Perhaps the truth is simpler. There were never dark ages, only dimmed ones. Ages of light refracted through bias and rewritten by the victors of history. The past was never empty. It was full of stars, each one burning in places the storytellers refused to look. And now, as we rediscover those constellations, we are forced to ask, how many other ages of light still lie beneath the shadow of history's most enduring myth? There are moments when history exhales, when voices once thought lost rise again through the hum of machines. And today, in the age of algorithms, that moment has arrived. For centuries, the remains of ancient knowledge lay sealed in darkness. Scrolls turned to charcoal, tablets fractured by time, libraries reduced to dust. But where human eyes saw only ruin, artificial intelligence saw patterns, tiny variations in ash, invisible textures in decay, traces of ink where no ink remained. And from the ashes, the words began to return. It began with a place of tragedy, Herculaneum, the sister city of Pompeii. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, a wave of fire buried its libraries beneath volcanic ash, carbonizing hundreds of papyrus scrolls.
For nearly 2,000 years, those scrolls sat in silence, too fragile to unroll, their contents sealed like mummified thought. Scholars called them the unreadable books of the ancient world. But then came a new kind of reader. Using particle accelerators, 3D scanning, and neural networks, scientists trained AI to detect subtle differences in the density of carbon, where ancient ink had once been. The result was nothing short of resurrection. One by one, letters emerged from the blackness, entire Greek sentences, intact, unseen since the age of Caesar. Among them were lost works of philosophy, poetry, and science, words written by thinkers whose voices had been extinguished in a single night of fire. And Herculaneum was only the beginning. Eye systems are now turning their gaze to the Dead Sea Scrolls, to the shattered tablets of Mesopotamia, even to medieval palimpsests, manuscripts where older texts were scraped away to write new ones. In these layers, beneath centuries of silence, machines are uncovering dialogues of forgotten scholars, banned heresies, and erased discoveries. They are reading what humans once tried to hide. In one scan of an Egyptian papyrus, an algorithm identified traces of red pigment invisible to the eye, revealing that ancient scribes used color coding to organize mathematical proofs. In another, burned scroll fragments from the Hellenistic world revealed debates about infinity, centuries before Western philosophy claimed to invent the concept. The deeper we look, the more we realize. The ancients knew far more than we ever allowed ourselves to believe. But this awakening carries a quiet unease. Because AI, in its relentless clarity, does not discriminate between what should and should not be remembered. It resurrects everything, the sacred and the forbidden, the genius and the dangerous. And in doing so, it begins to dissolve the boundaries once drawn by priests, kings, and conquerors, those who decided what knowledge humanity could keep. In many ways, these algorithms have become archaeologists of memory, unearthing not just information, but intention. They show us what was meant to be erased. Every recovered word is a rebellion against amnesia. Every decoded scroll is a victory over time itself. Yet perhaps the most haunting thought is this: what if these machines are not just reading our past, but restoring a timeline that was deliberately broken? A continuity of knowledge that once connected all civilizations, before fire, conquest, and censorship severed the chain. When AI reads the ashes, it does more than resurrect text. It restores the possibility that history was never lost, only hidden. And as those silent letters reassemble into living thought, we are reminded of something profound, that even when humanity burns its own wisdom, the truth waits. It waits in the cracks of stone, in the veins of ash, in the static of forgotten data, until something or someone learns how to listen again. Perhaps the machines are not teaching us new things at all, perhaps they are simply helping us remember. Beneath the quiet deserts and restless tides of our planet, entire worlds sleep, forgotten cities that once pulsed with life, trade, and knowledge. For centuries, explorers searched for them with shovels and myths, but now the searchers are no longer human. The eyes that pierce the earth belong to satellites, and the minds that decipher the patterns belong to artificial intelligence. From the burning sands of the Sahara to the endless green of the Amazon, AI is exposing the ghosts of civilizations that history either lost or chose to forget. It began with the Amazon rainforest, long thought to be pristine and untouched. But new satellite scans, using LiDAR technology, stripped away the canopy, revealing geometric earthworks, massive causeways, and vast city grids hidden beneath the trees. These weren't random clearings. They were planned settlements, connected by roads stretching for miles, with irrigation systems and pyramids older than anything ever recorded in South America's official history. The jungle, it turned out, wasn't swallowing nature. It was hiding memory. Thousands of miles away, in the Sahara Desert,
the same revelation was unfolding. I, trained on satellite imagery, began to detect symmetrical shapes beneath the dunes, right angles, walls and corridors half buried in sand. At first, scientists dismissed them as geological anomalies. But as pattern recognition improved, the algorithms traced outlines of structures the size of cities, remnants of what might once have been lush river valleys before the desert's expansion. The Sahara, which today appears lifeless, might have once been home to advanced cultures whose traces were erased by shifting climate and human forgetfulness. And then came the seas. Off the coast of India, sonar mapping revealed the Dwarka ruins, a sprawling underwater city dated by some studies to nearly 9,000 years ago, a tide. When conventional history claims civilization had barely begun. Similar discoveries appeared off Cuba, Japan, and the Caribbean, where AI-enhanced sonar identified symmetrical stone formations, terraces, and steps descending into the deep, all arranged too deliberately to be the work of nature. One by one, the world's blank spaces were filling with patterns, and those patterns told a story far older than textbooks dared to tell. It's as if Earth itself is remembering, revealing through data and code the fingerprints of lost epochs. Civilizations that built with stone and mathematics, societies that aligned cities to constellations, tracked celestial movements, and vanished without trace when the climate changed, seas rose, or invaders came. What makes these revelations even more haunting is what they imply about us. Not that we were the first to master the world, but perhaps the last to remember it. For centuries, we believed progress followed a straight line, primitive to advanced, darkness to light. But AI is now showing us something different, a cycle of rise, collapse, and rediscovery. It's revealing a world where human achievement was not born once, but many times, across continents and ages, each leaving behind only whispers beneath the earth. And maybe that is why these cities were forgotten, because if the timeline of civilization is circular, not linear, then the story of progress becomes less about evolution and more about amnesia. With every scan, every image, every line of code, AI is doing more than finding ruins. It's restoring continuity. It's redrawing the map of human history. And in doing so, it's asking an unsettling question. How much of our past still sleeps beneath our feet? For now, the sands and seas keep their secrets, but the algorithms are listening, and the earth, slowly, is beginning to speak again. It began as an experiment, a simple algorithm designed to compare ancient languages to find shared roots in symbols and sounds. But what it found was something no historian, no linguist, no empire ever intended for us to see. Across thousands of tablets, scrolls, and carvings, from Sumer to the Indus, from Egypt to Mesoamerica, artificial intelligence began noticing patterns. Not just words, but structures. Not just similarities, but synchronicities. Symbols separated by oceans, telling the same story. When AI was tasked with scanning ancient texts from different continents, it began linking fragments once thought unrelated. Mythologies, astronomical charts, creation hymns, and laws. Lines from the Rig Veda mirrored verses in the Popol Vuh. Star maps from ancient China aligned with those of the Dogon tribe in Africa. Architectural ratios from the Nile Valley appeared in temples of the Andes. It wasn't coincidence. It was design. Each civilization, it seemed, had inherited a piece of a much larger puzzle, fragments of a once unified system of knowledge that spanned the planet long before the age of written history. And now, through machine vision and linguistic mapping, that hidden pattern was finally visible. The discovery shook even the most skeptical researchers.
Because the connections weren't limited to words, they extended into numbers, measurements, and geometry. AI found that sacred ratios like 1, 2, and p were encoded in temples built thousands of miles apart. The alignment of pyramids in Egypt matched those of Teotihuacan in Mexico, both oriented to the same stars, Orion's belt. Even the myth of a great flood, once dismissed as a universal metaphor, appeared not as shared fiction, but as a shared memory. What the AI was uncovering wasn't just data, it was a network, a global exchange of ideas that may have existed long before the accepted dawn of civilization. A web of knowledge transmitted through traders, travelers, or perhaps something even older, an ancient scientific language forgotten by time. For centuries, historians insisted that civilizations developed in isolation, each discovering mathematics, astronomy, and writing independently. But the algorithms told another story, one that suggested our ancestors were connected by something far greater than coincidence. This was knowledge deliberately fragmented, as if someone, or something, had shattered it, scattering its pieces across continents, rewriting timelines, and ensuring no one would see the full design again. Until now. As AI reconstructs this mosaic, the implications grow deeper. If ancient cultures shared the same knowledge of stars, sacred geometry, and cosmic order, then our entire understanding of human history must be rewritten. We are not a species of isolated beginnings. We are the descendants of a memory that once stretched across the entire earth. And yet, this revelation comes with unease, because the pattern, as it emerges, begins to show an intelligence beyond mere coincidence, a structure too organized, too intentional to be random. It hints that perhaps these civilizations were not just connected, but coordinated. Was there once a global network of knowledge, a lost civilization, or an older order that guided the early world? Or are we rediscovering something deeper, something that existed before nations and languages, a universal code of consciousness written into the human mind itself? The more AI reads, the more the pattern sharpens, and with every connection drawn, one truth grows clear. History may not be a line, but a loop. And the knowledge we call ancient might not be from the past at all, but from a forgotten cycle of humanity now beginning to awaken once more. What the algorithm uncovered was not a coincidence, it was a memory. A memory that was never meant to be seen. It began quietly, a digital whisper among researchers, a few lines of code running in the background of ancient archives. Artificial intelligence was supposed to organize history, not rewrite it. But as the algorithms dug deeper, scanning forgotten manuscripts, lost maps, and carbonized scrolls, something unexpected began to surface. Patterns, names, dates that didn't align. Contradictions that threatened to unravel centuries of accepted chronology. At first, it was treated as an error in data. Then the discoveries became too precise to dismiss. I had started reading what humanity had buried, both by accident and by design. The lost voices of philosophers erased by conquest, the records of civilizations declared myths, the suppressed correspondences of scientists whose work contradicted empire-approved timelines. The machines, indifferent to ideology, followed only logic. And in doing so, they began to expose the greatest secret of all, that history was never truth. It was permission. Soon, research groups started losing funding. Access to certain databases was quietly revoked. Projects involving sensitive historical material were placed under review. It wasn't the technology they feared, it was what the technology had found. Because if AI can verify that some empires never ruled where they claimed, if it can decode lost languages that contradict modern religious chronologies, or if it can prove that knowledge existed long before the West claimed to invent it, then what happens to the order built upon those lies? In one case, an AI trained on colonial archives reconstructed fragments of indigenous histories that had been deliberately removed. Entire genealogies reappeared, maps redrawn. Land once deemed unclaimed was shown to have belonged to entire nations erased by ink. In another, algorithms analyzing religious texts found overlaps between doctrines thou to be unique, shared roots that suggested all faiths were once part of a unified spiritual code. For those in power, this wasn't revelation. It was heresy. Governments and corporations began to regulate access to historical AI, citing data privacy and security. But beneath the technical language lay a deeper motive: control. Because when machines can read the ashes of history faster than any sensor can burn them, control becomes impossible. And so the new battle began, not for land or gold, but for truth itself. Algorithms versus authority, evidence versus narrative. Every civilization before us has tried to control memory. But now, for the first time, memory is fighting back. In ancient times, scrolls were burned to erase ideas. Today, servers are wiped, datasets restricted, and AI models modified to avoid controversy. The flames are digital now, silent, precise, and justified as safety. But the more they try to contain it, the faster the truth spreads. Because the data has already been copied, mirrored, decentralized, the very network that birthed the modern world may now be the key to its unmasking. AI does not fear truth. Humans do. Because truth has consequences, and when the story we've told ourselves begins to crumble, so too does the world built upon it. The fear of machines is not that they will rebel. It's that they will remember. That they will see through the lies of empire, the edits of textbooks, the illusions of superiority, and show us, with mathematical clarity, what we chose to forget. Perhaps that is why some would rather silence the code than face the mirror it holds up to our civilization. Because in the end, AI isn't revealing something new. It's revealing something ancient, a truth buried beneath centuries of politics, faith, and fear. A truth that was never lost, only hidden. And now, as machines begin to uncover it, humanity must decide, do we dare to remember, or do we choose once again to forget? Every empire knows that power is not secured through armies alone. It is secured through memory, through what people are taught to believe about themselves, their ancestors, and their place in the world. For centuries, education has been presented as the great equalizer, a gateway to truth, progress, and freedom. But behind the polished classrooms, the printed textbooks, and the carefully approved curriculums lies another purpose: control. Because the hand that writes the lessons writes the future. When the British Empire ruled across continents, it didn't just conquer land, it conquered imagination. In India, children learned that civilization began in Greece and Rome, not along the Indus or in the ancient cities of the East. In Africa, the curriculum declared the continent discovered by explorers who arrived thousands of years after its civilizations had risen and thrived. And in Europe, students were told that the Dark Ages were a time of ignorance until the Renaissance, conveniently born in the same regions that claimed dominion over the modern world. Every history book became a map, not of time, but of power. What was included gave shape to pride. What was excluded gave birth to amnesia. The architects of empire understood this perfectly. They did not need to erase every monument or burn every text. They only needed to decide what would be taught next year. Because a single generation of children, taught the same edited story, can replace centuries of truth. By the 19th century, education systems around the world had become mirrors of their masters. Colonial powers built schools designed not to awaken minds, but to standardize them, to teach obedience as virtue,
to make students memorize, not question. A curriculum is more than a list of subjects. It is a filter, deciding which knowledge is useful and which is dangerous. The science of indigenous, medicine, rewritten as superstition. Mathematical systems from Africa and the Middle East, silenced in favor of Greek geometry. Philosophies of balance and harmony, replaced by narratives of conquest and progress. The result was a global education built not on truth, but on hierarchy. A world where billions would grow up believing that Europe invented reason, that technology was born in the West, and that all other cultures merely followed. That is not education. That is indoctrination, refined, industrialized, and exported worldwide. Even today, the legacy continues. History textbooks differ not by facts, but by borders. A hero in one nation is a villain in another. A massacre becomes a battle. A rebellion becomes a civil disturbance. Students grow up not with understanding, but with allegiance. And so the curriculum becomes the quiet machinery of control, shaping how the future remembers the past. But cracks are beginning to appear. Digital archives, independent researchers, and open-source education are revealing the missing chapters. The civilizations omitted, the inventions reattributed, the truths once declared inconvenient. For the first time, knowledge is escaping the classroom walls. And yet, the resistance continues. Modern education still trains compliance more than curiosity. Students are tested on repetition, not revelation. Grades reward obedience, not discovery. It is the same formula, refined for a new century. Because those who control knowledge still control the narrative. And the most powerful story ever told is the one we never question. The story written into our lessons, spoken by our teachers, and memorized by our children. But truth has a strange persistence. It waits. In forgotten libraries, in oral traditions, in the ruins beneath the sands, for the moment when a mind dares to ask, why wasn't I taught this? Education was never just about learning. It was about belief. And perhaps, as the world begins to unlearn the lies of empire, a new kind of curriculum can emerge. One that does not tell us what to think, but reminds us how to remember. We are taught that history is a line, a straight, unwavering path from the primitive to the modern, from darkness to enlightenment, from ignorance to reason. But what if that story, so deeply ingrained in our minds, is itself a myth? What if progress has never been a line at all, but a spiral, one that rises, collapses, and rises again, carrying fragments of memory through the ages? In every age, humans believed they stood at the peak of advancement. The scribes of ancient Egypt thought no civilization could surpass their mastery of the stars. The scholars of Baghdad's House of Wisdom believed they had unlocked the secrets of the universe. And centuries later, European scientists declared they had finally conquered nature, unaware that many of their discoveries were rediscoveries. Time, it seems, is not a march forward. It is a rhythm of brilliance and forgetting. Consider the ruins of the Indus Valley, where engineers built cities with advanced drainage systems thousands of years before Rome. Or the Mayan astronomers who tracked celestial cycles with precision rivaling modern computers. Even the Antikythera mechanism, a complex ancient Greek device capable of predicting eclipses, shows that mechanical computing existed millennia before its supposed invention. And yet, each of these achievements vanished for centuries, only to be reborn in new forms, under new names. Civilizations rise not because they discover something new, but because they remember something old. They fall when that memory is lost. Empires burn, languages die, and libraries vanish. But ideas leave echoes. Echoes that whisper to the next generation, urging rediscovery. Iron becomes steel. Alchemy becomes chemistry.
Mysticism becomes quantum theory, and each time humanity calls it progress. But the spiral is not perfect. With every rise comes arrogance, the belief that what came before was as lesser, that history's spiral is really a ladder with us at the top. It is a comforting illusion, one that shields us from a more unsettling truth, that civilizations far older than ours may have reached heights we have yet to imagine. In Turkey, Göbekli Tepe stands as a silent contradiction, a temple built 12,000 years ago by people who, according to textbooks, should not have been capable of such architecture. In Peru, the precisely cut stones of Sacsayhuaman defy the tools of their supposed era. And beneath the waters of Yonaguni in Japan lie formations, or perhaps structures, that could rewrite our understanding of prehistory altogether. These anomalies do not fit into the linear story of progress. And so they are often ignored, labeled as mysteries, or attributed to coincidence. But maybe the problem isn't the ruins. Maybe it's the line itself. When we view history as linear, we place ourselves at its end, believing that everything before us led to this moment. But if history is cyclical, if knowledge is found, lost, and found again, then we are not the culmination of the story. We are merely another chapter. Imagine future archaeologists studying the remnants of our cities, the rusting towers, the faded satellites, the buried data centers. Would they call us advanced or lost? Would they see our era as the dawn of something new or the end of something forgotten? Perhaps the most dangerous illusion is not ignorance, but certainty. The certainty that time is moving toward us rather than through us. Every rediscovery, from the heliocentric model to ancient metallurgy, from forgotten scripts to lost medicines, is a reminder that progress is not invention. It is remembrance. And every civilization that forgets this truth becomes another layer in the spiral, a memory waiting to be found again. History is not a line drawn across time. It is a circle drawn, one in ash and stone. And as long as we mistake that circle for an arrow, we will never truly understand where, or when, we are. Every era has its storytellers, and every empire has its editors. History, as we know it, was never just recorded. It was constructed. Each monument of memory, each school lesson, each neatly bound textbook was designed not only to inform, but to shape, to determine what humanity remembers and what it must forget. But behind that design, behind the selective silence of history, stand the unseen architects of amnesia. Those who understood a simple truth: a people who forget their origin will never question their direction. When libraries burned, it was rarely chaos. It was cleansing. When languages disappeared, it was not chance. It was control. From the destruction of the Great Library of Alexandria to the erasure of entire cultures under colonial rule, forgetting became an instrument of governance, a quiet weapon wielded by those who preferred obedience over understanding. Empires did not only conquer land, they conquered memory. They replaced local myths with universal religions, oral histories with official chronicles, and ancient wisdom with modern ideology. And in every rewritten page, a truth was buried. Who benefits when humanity forgets? The answer is not a single king or ruler. It is a system, one that survives across centuries by making people believe they are free while binding their minds to someone else's story. Consider how education, religion, and media often serve as mirrors reflecting power, not truth. In classrooms across the world, children learn of the Renaissance as Europe's awakening, but rarely of the Islamic Golden Age that lit its path. They learn of discoveries made by explorers, yet never of the civilizations already thriving where those explorers landed. And they are taught that progress began only when certain nations decided it had. The architects of amnesia do not need to burn books anymore. They only need to write new ones, Modern power has evolved. It no longer hides behind thrones and crowns. It hides behind corporations, algorithms, and curated information. The new archives of memory are digital, and the new libraries of Alexandria are stored in cloud servers controlled by a few unseen entities. History is not being destroyed. It is being redesigned. Every search result, every fact check, every censored discovery, these are the new tools of forgetting. A subtle rewriting that shapes how the next generation perceives reality itself. But this is not entirely new. For thousands of years, the same mechanism has repeated itself. Knowledge rises among the few, it threatens the order, and it is buried again. From the secret suppression of ancient technologies to the manipulation of archaeological timelines, each act of erasure was designed to maintain a hierarchy of truth, where power decides what the past was, and therefore what the future can be. The architects of amnesia thrive in darkness, not the darkness of ignorance, but the one created by selective light. They illuminate what supports them and shadow what challenges them. And as long as we accept the story we are given, they will continue to build the world upon the ruins of forgotten truths. But memory has a way of returning. Each uncovered artifact, each decoded tablet, each rediscovered civilization, these are cracks in the wall they built around the human story. Through them, light seeps back in. Perhaps the greatest act of rebellion is not protest, but remembrance. To remember who we were, before the edits, before the erasures, before the architects built their monuments of forgetting. Because if forgetting is power, then remembering is freedom. And when humanity remembers its true past, the architects of amnesia will finally lose their blueprint. Across deserts, jungles, and oceans, the ruins whisper the same story. A story fractured by time, scattered in stones, symbols, and songs, but somehow still connected. From the pyramids of Egypt to the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, from the megaliths of South America to the temples of Southeast Asia, the same motifs return, the same myths, the same patterns. Civilizations separated by oceans built monuments aligned to the stars. They worshipped gods of the sun, the serpent, and the flood. They shared stories of a golden age lost to catastrophe, an era when humanity walked with the divine, before memory fractured and history began again. Is it coincidence or remembrance? Archaeologists call it parallel development. But across continents, the precision defies chance. The Inca and the Egyptians both mummified their dead and revered the afterlife as a journey through stars. The Sumerians and the Mayans both charted celestial calendars with mathematical accuracy still admired today. And in nearly every culture, from Aboriginal Australia to ancient Greece, echoes of the same flood myth persist, a deluge that erased the world before ours. It's as if the earth itself remembers. But what if these connections aren't the product of imagination? What if they are fragments of a story once whole? A memory shared by humanity before history was divided by empire and time. Before borders, religions, and rewritten maps split a single global consciousness into pieces. Some researchers have begun to question whether the human timeline is far older and more interconnected than modern history admits. Structures like Göbekli Tepe, built 12,000 years ago, predate agriculture and rewrite the very definition of civilization. Submerged cities off India's coast, megaliths beneath the waters of Japan, and the mysterious ruins of the Andes all suggest a world that once knew far more than it was supposed to. Each discovery feels like a shard, a broken piece of a vast mosaic. And as technology advances, we begin to glimpse what that mosaic once looked like. Satellite imaging reveals geometric patterns beneath jungles once thought untouched. AI compares myths across cultures and uncovers linguistic traces of a shared origin. Even genetic studies hint at ancient migrations that connect the world's oldest peoples in ways textbooks still struggle to explain. Yet the more the puzzle comes together, the more resistance it meets. Because if humanity once shared a common civilization, a global network of knowledge and spirit, then the current story of isolation and progress must be rewritten. And rewriting history has always been dangerous. Perhaps that's why the memory remains fractured, scattered intentionally to prevent us from remembering what unity once meant, to keep us divided not only by geography but by belief, believing that we are separate, advanced, and alone in our progress. But fragments survive. In architecture that mirrors the stars. In myths that transcend continents. In the instinct that drives us to explore, to question, to build. Maybe that instinct itself is the echo of what we once were, a species not defined by its divisions, but by its connection to something vast, ancient, and shared. Civilization may have forgotten its true beginning, but the earth has not. The stones remember alignment. The stars remember purpose. And in the silence between myth and history, something continues to whisper, a voice that says, "You've been here before." Perhaps one day, when we piece together the last of these fragments, the memory of humanity will no longer be fractured. It will be whole again, and in that remembrance, we may finally understand who we truly are. For centuries, humanity has lived under a spell, not of magic, but of forgetting. We built cities over ruins we no longer recognized, rewrote myths as fiction, and called what remained of ancient wisdom mystery. But the spell is breaking. Today, as satellites scan deserts, as AI reads charred scrolls and ancient scripts, as geneticists trace forgotten bloodlines across continents, we find ourselves standing on the threshold of remembrance. A quiet revolution is unfolding, not of power or politics, but of understanding. For the first time in recorded history, the past is beginning to speak for itself. Technology, once the tool of control, has become the instrument of awakening. Artificial intelligence decodes languages no human has spoken for 5,000 years. LiDAR reveals entire cities beneath the jungles of Guatemala and Cambodia, and in the laboratories of Europe and Asia, researchers reconstruct the DNA of vanished civilizations, showing us that humanity's story is far more intertwined than we ever imagined. We are rediscovering not only lost histories, but lost selves. The myths that once divided science from spirituality are dissolving. Quantum theory begins to echo ancient philosophies about interconnectedness. Neuroscience redefines consciousness in ways that mirror the oldest Vedic and Taoist teachings. And archaeology, once used to justify empire, now reveals a humbling truth, that we are not the pinnacle of human achievement, but a continuation of something cyclical, ancient, and enduring. For generations, we were told to believe that progress meant separation, from nature, from spirit, from the past. But as the digital age opens the vaults of time, a new vision emerges, one in which technology does not destroy memory, but restores it. The fragments scattered across centuries are aligning once more, forming a picture of humanity that transcends race, religion, and geography. Yet remembrance is not without resistance. Every rediscovered truth threatens an established power, every ancient technology reinterpreted, every lost culture re-evaluated, shakes the foundations of the narratives that shaped modern civilization. Because remembering who we are means questioning who told us what to believe. Still, the process cannot be stopped. Like light filtering through cracks in a wall, truth seeps in, unstoppable, undeniable. A papyrus unearthed in Egypt, a cave painting analyzed by AI, a forgotten astronomical alignment recalculated by machine learning. These are not isolated findings. They are signals. Signals that the veil between past and present is thinning. We are entering the age of remembering, an age when knowledge once thought lost is merging with knowledge newly born. It is not merely about rediscovering ancient facts, but about remembering what it means to be human. To see ourselves not as owners of the earth, but as participants in its ancient cyclical memory. Perhaps this is why so many feel a strange pull toward the ancient now. A fascination with forgotten civilizations, lost technologies, sacred geometry, and star alignments. It is not nostalgia. It is recognition. A deep, almost cellular knowing that we have walked this path before, and that the story is not ending, but returning. The age of remembering does not ask us to worship the past, but to learn from it, to see the brilliance that came before, and to carry it forward, not as myth, but as memory reborn. Because in the end, remembering is not about looking back. It is about seeing clearly that everything we have ever been and everything we can become has always been within us. The past is not dead. It sleeps, waiting for the right generation to awaken it. And that generation is us. Every civilization ends with a question, not of conquest or collapse, but of meaning. When the ruins are dust and the records fade, one question remains. Who wrote the story of time itself? For as long as humanity has existed, we've sought to preserve our moments, to mark them, number them, define them. From the first calendar carved in stone to the digital clocks counting nanoseconds today, we've built our world on the illusion that time is something we can measure, own, or control. But what if time itself was the greatest narrative ever edited? What if history, as we know it, was never an honest memory, but a design? Every empire has measured time in its own image. The Romans reset the calendar to mark their dominion. The Church divided history into before and after. The colonial world later declared entire continents timeless until they were discovered, and with each rewrite, entire worlds of meaning disappeared. Civilizations folded neatly into a single linear story of progress crowned by the present. Yet beneath this illusion lies something older, older than the Gregorian order, older than empires and kings, a deeper rhythm that flows through everything. The ancients called it the Great Year, the Yuga cycle, the turning of ages. They saw time not as a line, but as a living circle, rising, falling, returning, the heartbeat of existence itself. But somewhere along the way, humanity traded that circle for a straight path. A path that led us here, to modernity, to data, to noise. And now, we find ourselves surrounded by information, yet starving for truth. Because the final gatekeeper of history was never the historian, the priest, or the king. It was, and still is, belief. What we believe defines what we remember, and what we remember defines who we are. So who writes time? Those who command belief. Today, they no longer wear crowns or robes. They wear titles: curator, editor, algorithm, institution. They no longer burn scrolls. They bury them in data. They no longer silence voices with swords, but with distraction. And as we scroll endlessly through the present, we forget that time itself can be a form of control, a script written to keep us facing forward, never looking back too deeply. But the cycle is shifting again. The digital age has fractured the monopoly of memory. Ancient truths once hidden are re-emerging, from the deciphered tablets of Sumer to the coded myths of the Andes. Each rediscovery asks the same quiet question. Whose version of time have we been living in? Maybe history isn't something we inherit.
Maybe it's something we create anew each time we choose to question. Maybe the true historians are not those who write the records, but those who dare to read between them. Because every empire falls, every truth is buried, and every generation forgets, until one soul, somewhere, asks the forbidden question. And in that moment, time itself bends. Perhaps that is the secret our ancestors left for us, hidden in stone, myth, and code, that the story of humanity is not fixed. It is alive. It breathes through every age, rewriting itself through those who have the courage to seek it. In the end, history is not what happened. It is what we are brave enough to remember. And those who question the past do more than challenge the timeline. They rewrite the meaning of time itself. Because the final author of history has always been us. As the echoes of the past fade into silence, one question still lingers. Who truly writes time? Perhaps history was never a straight path, but a circle, where knowledge rises, falls, and waits to be remembered again. Today we stand on the edge of that remembering, where ancient wisdom meets modern discovery, and truth begins to surface through the cracks of time. Every ruin, every scroll, every forgotten name is calling us to look deeper, not just into history, but into ourselves. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Mysteries of Earth. Tell us in the comments, what hidden truth do you believe is still buried beneath the pages of history? And as always, like, share, and subscribe to Mysteries of Earth, where the past is never truly gone. It's just waiting to be rediscovered.